In last week's video, I upgraded Tamiya's Mk.IV with a motor into a fully remote-controlled tank. While it was an absolute joy to build, it was even more fun to drive. But after all of that driving in the garden, I needed to clean it for paint. And since the usual soap and water bath were out of the question with all of those electronics inside, I used isopropyl alcohol instead. And that really seemed to do the trick. With that done, I stuck the loose parts to a stick and moved everything back outside. Since it would have taken way too long to paint all of this with an airbrush, I decided on using a rattle can of Mr. Surfacer. This came out extremely smooth, and it was the perfect base to start the airbrushing process. Since I knew I would be heavily manipulating this base coat with oils later, I started with, of all colors, US Desert Tan by Meng. I sprayed everything in a cloudy pattern and built up the colors little by little, focusing more paint in the middle sections of the panels and less where the rivets were to simulate some shadow. For the highlighted parts on the top, I used some masking tape to break up the harsh lines to just give it a little extra sharpness. This model has lots of large flat sides, so it's a perfect place to practice your airbrushing because it's going to take a while. After some highlights were painted, I used Desert Tan Shadow, also by Meng, for all the lower portions of the tank. Then it was time to start the oil painting. I've been watching a lot of Mike Rinaldi's videos. If you haven't checked any of those out, you really should. He does great tips and tricks on his method of oil painting. While I don't have it down completely, I think I've made a hybrid version of that process for now. You can see I'm using a lot of dot filters here and stippling. But his method teaches you to dry out the mineral spirits from the stippling brush. This keeps you from removing all the oils that you just applied to the model. Using the cardboard palette, you wick away as much of the mineral spirits as you can and use a pretty dry brush to blend everything out. Now you can see the rich tones on the main hull, and I wanted the outer gun mounts to appear lighter in color. So for this, I simply did not add the yellow to build up the richness and stayed with just the buff. For the lower parts where I knew mud would be accumulating, I went over everything with some brown oil. You can see the difference is pretty dramatic. The top of the sponsons are such a fun and unique thing to paint in weather. The tracks are basically wrapped around the hull, and mud and dirt would accumulate here. I've basically used the same process over the entire vehicle, just with different colors. For building up mud, I apply a small amount of brown paint, and then I use my rounded brush to stipple it in and smooth out the edges. After that, I would use a brush with more mineral spirits than paint and simply touch it to the surface, letting the mixture spread out naturally on its own. This was repeated anywhere mud would accumulate, keeping darker tones closer to where it would be piled, and letting it become lighter as it spread out. And don't worry if you mess any of this up, because I'm actually going to be covering most of the darker areas with some actual mud. But I need to know where it's going to be, so when the running gear goes on, I don't have any obstructions. Next, it was time to put on the decals. Very straightforward, except for anywhere everything needed to go over these rivets, which are quite large. And you just do that with any sort of decal medium that softens the decals up. And I just use a Q-tip to push those in place, making sure all the liquid is out from behind the back of them. Then it was back to some oil paints, this time with a highlight color, and again, the same process was used. Applying a good amount of oil paint, and then stippling it out with a brush with very little, but still some, of the mineral spirits. So here we are building up some of the mud and dirt that I felt was necessary, using the brown oil paint as a guide so that we know exactly where we want that paint to be. Here you can see I'm using this acrylic-based mixture from AK. It works very good, but you really want to make sure before it dries that you wet all of the edges so it blends nicely. That's how it would look in real life, and you don't want harsh edges to your mud because it doesn't just stop. And here we need to make sure that the tracks are in place for this. So I decided the tracks should probably be done before I put them on here. And this was one of the most enjoyable parts of the build. I'm really not much of a track master. They're usually the last thing I think about, but since these are so front and center on this tank, I really wanted to take my time and do them right. Reference photos were extremely helpful in this case. There's quite a few examples that show the running gear, tracks for that matter, and those were extremely helpful. Here again, because this tank is going to move, I needed to be very careful with applying these pastes so that all of the tracks could individually still move when it was time to operate them. After that little layer dried, everything got an oil wash with brown, and then I went back over with a black and stippled that in where the tracks would have remained relatively mud-free. Then I stippled everything to give it a little bit more depth, both with a very dark brown and then another light earth tone. Now I know on the battlefield, these probably would not have been polished clean, but I really couldn't resist how cool it looks to have all of this polished up with a pencil. Where the points of contact would be, there would obviously be some heavy chipping damage. And then it was time to put the tracks on, and I just thought that looked fantastic. After that, since I had the sponge out, I decided to tackle the exhaust. This cover was chipped first because I feel like there would be a lot of chipping there with things put in that bin. I tried a few different methods for the exhaust. I think it came out great in the end, but I actually did a few different layers that weren't really that necessary. So everything you see here ends up getting covered by the orange and then dark chipped layers. And then I went back over it with a thin wash around the edges. And that looked pretty good. And with all these rivets, I had to painstakingly highlight all of them to bring them back. And then the wood beam got a faux wood look. There's not a ton of detail on it, and I'm not exactly sure I have that painted correctly, but that's going to be how it is for now. Then it was time for even more speckling. This time with streaking grime and some dust products. And then I wanted to replicate some oil staining. Again, reference photos are key when you want to make it look realistic. And again, all done with just oils. On the original tank, there is at least one picture of the tank, stuck in a ditch, and it had some odd, I don't know, paint around the words. I don't know how they painted the name on this, so I just wanted to replicate it as realistically as possible. And anywhere else that there would be dust and grime from those awesome tracks. But after that, it was just time to put some finishing touches on the tank and call it a day. The tracks took absolutely the longest part, but I'm extremely pleased with how this came out, and I think there might be a trench diorama in this thing's future. At least a place to store it while I'm not driving it around the yard. Thank you so much for watching. It's been a blast. Tune in next time, and see you then. And don't forget, this thing can drive.